Hello everyone and welcome to the Tank Club. Today we're going to be giving you an update to my dungeon tank build, and this is a build that is designed for optimized 4-person content, most specifically dungeon content. So when it comes to optimized builds for 4-person content, there are a few different options to consider, and it really depends on your group, what classes people are using, if you're with a healer, if you've just got 3 damage dealers. There's a lot of different things to think about. When it comes to dungeon content, there is a lot more good options for your tank setup and your gear compared to things like trials. The most important thing for 4-person content is individual performance, and your gear choices will only be affecting 2 to 3 damage dealers. So the way your gear sets work and perform are very different to 12-person trials when you've got 8 damage dealers. So you've got a lot of different things that are going to work more effectively in dungeon content than they would if you were in a trial. So we're going to start off with the tank class, and the best tank class for doing dungeon content is whatever you want. So for me personally, I prefer the Dragon Knight tank. They offer the most utility and benefit towards the group. Other good options are obviously the Warden. So if you want to go for damage buffs, the DK is very good. If you want to go for defensive buffs, the Warden's very good. You can play as any class. Obviously every class has their strengths and weaknesses. Nightblades, for example, very good this patch. They've got huge damage reduction to the enemy. They're able to deal with high damage situations probably better than most of the classes, so that is something to think about. The Necromancer tank doesn't have as much utility as it used to, but it can still be used. You can use any class you want, so it's completely up to you. When it comes to tank race, again, it's something you can choose. You can pick whatever you want. The Nord would typically be the best one in terms of giving you the extra resistances. That is very, very helpful. You also get a little bit of ulti gain by choosing the Nord. However, you don't need to be a Nord to reach the resistance cap of 33,000. You can obtain that quite easily. So you could go with a sustain class if you wanted to, something like an Imperial, a Red Guard, an Argonian, whatever you want. If you just want to pick something based on the appearance of how it looks, then that is absolutely fine. When it comes to optimizing your tank race, it's not that important. It's more important for damage dealers and healers because they will get a buff to their damage and their healing output based on their race. But for tanking, the only thing that we really benefit from is being a Nord and those extra resistances. What those resistances mean is we can maybe have a bit more versatility with our champion points and the skills we use because we're already going to be at the resistance cap quite easily. So for Mundus Stone, you want to pick the Atronach Mundus Stone. This is the best one to choose because we need sustain on this build. For dungeons, you need sustain, you need magicka. You need magicka to be able to cast all your skills and keep up all your buffs. If you really, really wanted to, you could choose something else like the Lady or the Steed are the only other 2 good options really. The Lady giving you extra resistances, which you don't really need, but you could use it if you're really far below the resistance cap and you want to push them to the limit so that you're taking less damage. If you wanted to go with the Steed for a bit more movement speed and health recovery, that is an option, but it's not going to be as good as the Atronach. For your attributes, again, this is something you can kind of adjust to your own preference. I like to go with either all my points into health, or I like to kind of bring up those, depending on the fight I'm doing, I like to bring up my different stat pools, my magicka a bit higher, maybe my stamina a bit higher. It depends on how I'm going to play. If I'm in a new dungeon, I like to have higher stat pools because I'm probably going to be blocking for longer because I don't know the mechanics. When I do know the mechanics and I'm blocking less, then I don't need as much stamina. So then I drop my stats down and I go all into health so I can take more damage unblocked so I don't have to block as much. And it really just depends on your playstyle, but all into health is a good option. If you want to split them because you're less experienced and you want more stamina because you're going to block more, you want more magicka because you keep spamming skills to try and get more resources back or whatever it is you're doing, that is up to you. And obviously if you're a race that has a magicka bonus, then you want to be choosing some points into stamina to make sure your stamina is higher than your magicka. When it comes to food, again, we've got some good options. We've got Bewitched Sugar Skulls, which is a very good option to bring up those max stats. If you don't need the max stats like I've just explained, you can go with the Smoked Bear. So when you go with Smoked Bear, you get health, which is going to take your health really high, but then you also get health recovery, stamina recovery, and magicka recovery. This is good when you're trying to push your magicka recovery up, so you can cast more, and your stamina recovery a little bit is going to be helpful because if you're not blocking as much, then you're going to benefit from stamina recovery as well, and health recovery, ticking a little bit more healing. So that is another good option. If those are too expensive for you, you could also go with Jewels of Misrule or Red Frothgar. those are two of the types of food that you could use that are going to give you similar benefits as well. When it comes to potions, first of all, you've got the tri-stat potions. Those are the main potions that you're going to want to use. The best way to craft those are with Columbine, Bugloss, and Mountain Flower. That's the cheapest combination. And you're going to use those for most things. So it gives you health, magic, stamina back, and it gives you the 3 recoveries as well. If you've got a bit more gold to spend and you want to kind of push your build a bit more optimized, you'd go with the Essence of Magicka, which are the heroism potions. They're going to give you Magicka back, stamina back, your Magicka and stamina recovery, and they're going to give you minor heroism, which is going to give you 1 ultimate every 1.5 seconds. So that's another way to build your ultimate faster, but they are expensive. You're going to need dragon's blood and things like that. So those aren't necessary if you can't afford them, but if you really wanted to push a little bit more optimization, then you could use those. Okay, now we're going to get onto the gear sets, and as I mentioned before, there's a lot of different gear options and you have to choose the best option for you. My build is one way of playing, you might want to play it a different way. So first of all, monster sets. Number 1 monster set, Archdruid. The best monster set to use for boss fights because it's going to help bring up that major vulnerability uptime. You've also got Nazare, which is still very good, so it's very comparable to Archdruid. You would use Nazare to maintain your minor vulnerability, your major vulnerability, your minor brittle. What you want to get as many things on the boss as possible. Use your ult, proc your Nazare, and get that incredibly high extended duration. Another option is Tremor Scale. So if you're in a group with medium armor damage dealers, they'll probably be under the pen cap, so you'd want to use Tremor Scale for that. Another option is the Spulder of Ruin. That's probably one of the better options more for ad pulls. So for ad pulls, you'd want to use Spulder of Ruin, and then on boss fights, you'd want to use Archdruid, Nazare, or Tremor Scale. Other options include Engine Guardian. If you are an inexperienced player and you want a bit of resources for yourself because you're having a hard time, Engine Guardian, the best set in the game for dealing with that situation. If you're in a 3 damage dealer group, they might be really struggling for sustain. If so, you might want to consider Symphony of Blades, but I personally don't like using that. For 5-piece gear sets, number 1 on the list, Turning Tide. This is great for everything in terms of dungeon content. You want it for ad pulls because as you're running through ad pulls, you proc it, it hits everything on every single ad pull, and you get the debuff of the major vulnerability for all ads on every ad pull. When you get to bosses, when you combine your Turning Tide with your Archdruid, you get 100% uptime of major vulnerability, which is incredibly strong for dungeon content. It increases the group's DPS by a huge amount, so it works very, very well. The second set is Vestment of Olorim, and this is a great set because it buffs your group's spell and weapon damage by a large amount. You get major courage, so it's a great set. However, if you've got a healer in your group, this is not so good of a set because they'll be using a gear set that already provides that particular buff. So if that is the case, you would then switch to Powerful Assault, which would be the next best option because that provides, again, weapon and spell damage, which is going to increase your group's DPS. Now, if you're in some groups where they're not stacking in close, Powerful Assault won't be a good option. If you want something a bit simpler to use, you've got Yolnahkrin, the Claw of Yolnahkrin set. And this is a very good set because you just taunt and it procs the gear set and everybody gets a buff. The radius on it is much bigger than things like Powerful Assault, and Olorim has a circle on the floor people have to stand in, so sometimes those are not great options. So Yolnahkrin is a very good option as well. Then you've got Pearlescent Ward, which is a fantastic set because it's just a huge aura set, and for boss fights especially it's great, especially for doing pickup groups. When you're in a pickup group dungeon, people are probably going to die, so you get a nice damage buff when everyone's alive, and if people start to die, you start to get damage reduction instead, which allows you to potentially save a fight. So this is a great option, mainly for progression and pickup groups. Next we've got Crimson Oath. Now if you're using Tremor Scale, you don't need Crimson Oath and vice versa, so you would only use Crimson Oath if you don't have Tremor Scale, and the same the other way round if you're in a group with medium armor damage dealers. And that's because they're not at the pen cap, so this will increase the group DPS because it will push the group to the pen cap. But is it worth using Crimson Oath compared to Tremor Scale? It's really up to you, so that is another choice for you to make. Another gear set is Drake's Rush. When you actually look at how useful this is, if you're in a group where you've got 3 damage dealers and a tank and everybody uses their ultimates on cooldown, then this is an excellent set because you're going to get a huge DPS increase. It's a bigger DPS increase than things like Claw of Yolnahkrin because if people are using their ultimates on cooldown, the amount of damage that they're doing additionally from having that extra ultimate is massive. So definitely consider Drake's Rush now, especially because people did have major heroism in the past from Oaken Soul, and now that's not there. So even if you've got Oaken Soul users in your group, they're going to get a huge benefit from Drake's Rush. Another gear set would be Pangrit's Den Mother. This came with the Lost Depths patch. This is the same buff as Yolnahkrin, but it's an easier set to obtain. You get it from doing dungeons, so you could obtain this gear set as like a Yolnahkrin replacement set for doing 4-man content. Pangrit Den Mother is not good for trials and stuff. It is literally just a dungeon set, so obviously it's good to pick up if you want Yolnahkrin, you want an easy to use set and you don't want to do trials. This is your dungeon alternative. And finally we've got Saxhleel Champion, which if you are in those kind of pickup groups, you could potentially use this as another safety set so you can spam barriers and still provide the major force uptime. Finally we've got weapon sets, and there's only 2 options here, and there's 2 specific times to use them. You use Void Bash from Vateshran Hollows, the Vateshran one-handed shield. It's the absolute best in slot. You use that for ad pulls, you have to. You've got to try and get it. You don't have to do it on Vet, you should do normal Vateshran. If you can hit 10k DPS by putting some medium armor gear on your tank, it can be done easily. I've done it myself a number of times. I've done it on Vet as well on my tank, to be fair, so it can be done. And you really want to get this, because you press one button and it stacks an entire ad pull with one button press. In comparison, if you're not on a Dragon Knight tank and you've got to use a Necromancer, or you've got to use a Warden, or you've got to use a Sorcerer tank and you're using Silver Leash to chain everything in, that costs like 3,500 stamina per chain. If you've got 6 enemies, you've got no stamina left. On the flip side, if you've got Void Bash, you press one button, it uses 2,500 stamina and it pulls everything in one go. So this is absolutely best in slot. It makes stacking easy, it makes everything stack very nicely. It's just the must-have set for dungeon content. Now when you're on boss fights, you don't want to use Void Bash because it's not worth using for boss fights. You want to use Puncturing Remedy, which is the Master's one-handed shield. This is going to give you resistances and it's going to give you health. So every time you taunt, you're going to buff your resistances, you're going to get a heal. And it's quite a big burst heal as well, so especially on classes that don't have a burst heal. The Templar tank doesn't have a burst heal, so for example, you're standing in your heals over time and then you need a burst heal really quick. You've got that on, it's going to give you a nice big heal. And this is especially good when you're not using a healer in a group, you're just a tank on your own. And the reason why these weapon sets work is because nearly every single set that you would use for dungeons is able to be used just on one bar. So Turning Tide would be a body set, but then you've got Olorim, Powerful Assault, Yolnahkrin, Drake's Rush, Crimson Oath are all 1-bar gear sets. You don't need to double bar them. So it doesn't really matter what sets you're using. The only ones you really have to double bar are Turning Tide and Pearlescent Ward. Everything else can be kind of put onto the back bar and then just activated, and that means you've got the ability to use a weapon set. As we mentioned before, Mythic Items, there isn't really any other good Mythic Items. Spalder of Ruin is fantastic for ad pulls because obviously you don't want to waste your Nazarene ad pulls, and Archdruid isn't very good or reliable in ad pulls, especially if you're already wearing Turning Tide, you don't need Archdruid for ad pulls. So Spalder of Ruin combined with a one-piece Magma or a one-piece Baron Thirsk, which is quite easy to pick up from the Imperial City. You could use either one of those, and that is a great option as well. Okay, so gear traits and enchants. When we are looking at gear traits, my personal preference is to use Divine's gear, and I've switched away from Sturdy. Obviously, if you are a newer player, if you are blocking for long periods of time, Sturdy is still going to be the most valuable option. Now in a 5-1-1 setup with 5 heavy, 1 medium, 1 light, in all Divines, my block cost is 1,000. Now that is a little bit higher than other people. If I wanted to lower this down a little bit more, I could use 2 medium pieces to bring that down. But all Divine's gear is giving me additional sustain, so it really depends how you play. If you block more, use Sturdy. If you block less, use Divines. Any other trait isn't really worth using. I've noticed some people keep commenting on the reinforced use. You don't need it. You already hit the resistance cap if you're a Nord, and you've got your resistance buff and your resistance champion points. Especially if you're using things like Resolving Vigor to prop Powerful Assault, you'll absolutely already be at the resistance cap. So using something like Reinforced just is not worth it. On the gear, you want to use Prismatic Defense Enchants. The reason for that is you get over 2,000 more total resources compared to using a single stat enchant. Obviously they're very expensive, so if you wanted to bring up your stats in other ways, you can just alternate different ones. So use Magicka, Stamina and Health if you want. I personally don't like to. If you wanted to bring up those Magicka and Stamina stats, you could do that as well. So you could put all your points into Health and then use Stamina enchants on the big pieces and Magicka on small pieces to bring everything up a little bit more. It really is up to you, but this is something you can kind of adjust to your own needs, but Prismatic Defense would be the best option. Okay, weapon traits and enchants. On your one-hander, the best option, the only option for increasing group DPS is to use a charged one-hander with a shock glyph. What this does is it inflicts concussion on the enemy, increasing your group's damage by 5%. However, this isn't essentially needed all the time, because if you're with group members that are using certain skills that already provide that, then you don't need it. If you're on a Warden, for example, they already get this from Fetcher Infection, so you don't need it. So you could use something else, but Charged Shock is the only way really to increase group damage with your one-handed weapon and enchant. If you want some more sustain, you would use Infused with a Absorb Stamina enchant. You can also use Decisive if you want to gain more ultimate, and you can use a defending one-hander because your one-hander is making very little impact. If you wanted to use a defending one-hander to reach the resistance cap, that would be better than using Reinforced Gear because it's just one piece of something that's very, very minimal, and then you can keep your sustain from your Divines or your Sturdy. So if you did want to push that, that'd be a great way to do it. On your back bar, your Ice Staff. You only want to use Ice Staff, nothing else is worth using. So Ice Staff only, and you want that to be an Infused Crusher. The only difference that you could make here is for ad pulls, you could switch this over and use a Charged Staff, because this is going to help. In a minute when we go over the skills, I'll show you what we're going to be doing, but we want to be inflicting the chilled effect on the enemies. So by using a Charged Staff, it's going to guarantee we're going to get the chilled effect every single time, meaning we're going to be able to achieve the immobilizations that we want from the skills that we're going to use on every class. For the jewelry, the only real trait that's worth using for your jewelry is Infused. Infused provides so much additional benefit. Obviously there's other things you can use, like Swift for ad pulls is very good, so you can get ahead and you keep ahead and you can stack everything fast. Swift is good. Some people like to use Triune, and that's okay if you really wanted to. It's going to bring up your max stats, but it's not necessary. For the best benefit to your sustain, you want to be using Infused, and for most players, Infused Magicka Recovery is your best option, because Infused Magicka Recovery is ticking constantly, and if you're using up your Magicka, you're then getting more Magicka back, and that's how it works. So Magicka Recovery benefits the majority of players. Other options, though, include Magicka Cost Reduction. So if you're on a class like a Necromancer that's using a lot of Magicka skills, maybe you're spamming Blast Bones to create more corpses, to get more ultimate back within the correct potency, then using something like Magicka Cost Reduction would be very, very good in that situation instead, because they don't really use many stamina skills. If you cast a lot of skills and you have high enough Magicka Recovery to sustain doing so, Prismatic Cost Reduction would be the best option. But this doesn't work if you have no recovery. So you cannot do cost reduction if you don't have enough incoming resources. So this is why if you're using Divines, if you're using the same food and the potions on cooldown and you've got enough Magicka Recovery, then using Prismatic Cost Reduction is going to be very good, because it's going to reduce the cost of your stamina skills, your Magicka skills and your health skills as well. So this is a great option, but it doesn't work if you don't have enough recovery. So just remember that. It's not worth switching away from Magicka Recovery fully if you don't have enough to sustain casting. And you have to cast a lot for Prismatic Cost Reduction to be more beneficial. Like for people who've got extremely high actions per minute, people who are casting skills every second on the global cooldown, then you're going to benefit much more from Prismatic Cost Reduction, because it's reducing the cost of everything. But it only works if you cast in a lot of skills and you have enough recovery to sustain doing so. If you wanted to use the Divine setup and not the Sturdy one, but you still block quite a lot, then using one Infused Bracing would bring your block cost down to almost the same as using a full set of Sturdy, but then it means you can use two with Magicka Recovery or Cost Reduction or whatever it is you want to do, and you're still going to be able to achieve similar sustain levels that I am, but with just that extra bracing bringing the cost down of your block. Okay, when we move on to skills now, and every single class is being used here. We can use any class with this build. It doesn't matter what you are, we can set up in a similar way. So the best way to set up for this particular content, so generically when you set up this build, you've got an ad pull setup and a boss setup. For your ads, you've got skills that are going to benefit in terms of crowd control. So You would always use Pierce Armor because that's going to give you Major Breach and your Minor Breach and your Taunt. Then you're going to use Razor Caltrops, which is a snare and an area of effect Major Breach. It breaches everything that is stood inside it, and it snares the enemy from getting to your group, so it slows everything down so you've got time to crowd control it. Next you use like a class skill, it's a flex skill, it's whatever is going to benefit you, and then you want your class heal, and then you want to use Power Slam for ad pulls because this is going to proc your Void Bash there. If you're not using Void Bash, slot whatever you want. On your back bar you would use Destructive Clench, Frost Clench, which is a great skill. It provides Major Maim, Minor Maim, Minor Brittle. It's an immobilization, it's a taunt, it does a lot of things. For ad pulls, however, you could use Inner Rage instead because that won't immobilize enemies and Frost Clench will. So Frost Clench in ad pulls isn't as good because it does that, but then you can switch it out the other way around. On ad pulls, then you want to use Pulsar, and Pulsar is a fantastic skill. It applies Minor Mangle, which reduces all of the ad's health straight away by 10%. So you instantly do a huge amount of damage to enemies by running in and causing Minor Mangle. You also apply minor protection to yourself and your group members, but this also has a triple chance to apply the chilled effect, and this is vital. So we apply the chilled effect to the enemy. This inflicts Minor Maim and Minor Brittle, and then we combine this with our next skill, Elemental Blockade. So Elemental Blockade will immobilize any chilled enemies. So we go into an ad pull, we've got Blockade on the ground, and then we cast Pulsar. That's going to guarantee pretty much to chill them, which then causes an immobilization. So this is useful on all classes. It doesn't matter what class you are, you can do this type of crowd control, Caltrops, Blockade and Pulsar on every single class. And the reason why this is so good is because it causes so many different effects to the enemy. It just increases DPS by a huge amount, and it's just the most efficient way to crowd control because there's nothing else that can quite compare to how good this is. Every class has crowd control skills, like the Dragon Knight has Talons, but it's not as good as the amount of benefit you're going to get from Elemental Blockade and Pulsar combined. So if you've not started doing this yet, definitely have a little look at doing it, especially if you've got Void Bash as well. Power Slam, Caltrops, Blockade and Pulsar as a combination is just so good. You can't combine things like a Fear with a Chain, so if you're chaining enemies and then trying to fear them, it doesn't work, but pulling in an enemy and snaring them with Caltrops and chilling them with Blockade and immobilizing them with Pulsar all works. It all works in combination with each other, so it works extremely well. The next skill would be Balance, and this is just for your Magicka Sustain and your Major Resolve. It's going to give you all those resistances, and this is just a great way to keep up your Magicka resources. You just cast it, it costs a little bit of health, and then you need a Chain skill for pulling in any stragglers when Power Slam doesn't quite get everything. For your ultimates, you want to use Replenishing Barrier on your front bar for the extra Magicka recovery, and on your back bar, your Aggressive Horn, because that is the prominent way of providing a buff to your group. When you move on to boss fights, the only things you really need to change here, you definitely want to be using Frost Clench instead of Inner Rage for boss fights. You don't need Pulsar in boss fights because you're going to get those similar benefits from Destructive Clench. So you would drop that for a group buff, and you also don't need Power Slam for boss fights as well because you can't pull them in with Void Bash. You wouldn't want to use Void Bash on boss fights, so you'd switch that for another group buff. So if we look at my Dragon Knight bar setup here, on ad pulls, pretty much as I explained, and every class has pretty much the same setup. And then for boss fights, I obviously use Pierce Armor, Engulfing Flames, Igneous Shield, Coagulating Blood, Stone Giant and Replenishing Barrier on the front bar, and then on the back bar I've got Destructive Clench, Unrelenting Grip, Elemental Blockade, Balance, Razor Caltrops, and Aggressive Horn. Obviously, if you're not using Powerful Assault, you don't need to use Razor Caltrops there, or you could use a Heal over time or Resolving Vigor for the extra resistances for the boss fights, which is going to be really helpful getting you to the resistance cap. I'm just going to pop up on the screen now skills for every class. If you want more information on what these skills are, make sure you go and check out the website, thetankclub.com, and look for the Dungeon Tank build on there, and the link is in the description below as well. Finally, we're on to the champion points, and this is quite a simple way of setting up. For your blue champion points, you want to just go with the mitigation CP of Ironclad, Duelist Rebuff, Enduring Resolve, and Unassailable. There are fights where you just absolutely don't need things like Unassailable, so AoE damage fights are very rare, so high AoE damage fights are quite rare. So use Bulwark instead when that is the case, because you just don't need it. For your red CP, your main things here, Boundless Vitality, you definitely want to take that for the extra health, Fortified for the extra resistances, and then Rejuvenation for the guaranteed health, magicka and stamina recovery. On ad pulls, you want to use Celerity for the movement speed bonus, And then for boss fights, in most situations, bracing anchor is the best bet, just because it increases your block mitigation, so when you block those big attacks, they do a lot less damage. Obviously, there are other CPs there that you could use if you really wanted to. Sustain by Suffering, Slippery, Expert Evasion, Ward Master. Really depends on the way that you play the game. So those are options, but those 5 that I mentioned are the main ones that I like to use myself. Okay, everyone, that is everything for this dungeon tank build for the Lost Depths and Firesong DLCs. If you've got any questions, make sure you come and join us over on the Tank Club Discord. If you want to see any more builds or information, you can also check out the Tank Club website, thetankclub.com. If you've enjoyed the content, make sure you check out our Patreon. You can subscribe on there for as little as £3 a month, and it just helps us keep the website going, keep the videos going, keep the content coming, make sure we can keep helping ESL tanks even more into the future. So thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.